obstacles to our evolution being a ideology that conditions how we see ourselves in the world, and that ideology actually being just the kind of the conceptual layer of something a lot bigger. You may have noticed that people do not often change their beliefs based on evidence and logic. That's because beliefs are, and this whole thing about change your beliefs, then you can change your reality, that assumes that you can actually change your beliefs through an effort of will. If that assumption is false, then the recipe for creating your perfect life by changing your beliefs is a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for futility. And why isn't that working? Well, the reason that it's not working is that beliefs, stories, and ideologies are one layer of an entire state of being. When the state of being is ready to change, then you will be in a place where you can be persuaded, where you can be impacted by evidence and logic. If you are not in that place, if you are in a state of being that is robust, you have not finished with that state of being, you will have an intellectual immune system that will keep out data points that don't correspond to the belief systems that correspond to that state of being. So, if we want to talk about obstacles to evolution, the question really, and talk about, I mean, because it looks, if we look at, like, just say the evolution that is going to bring humanity to a sustainable relationship to the rest of life, like that would be a good evolution to have. And it looks like we're going to have to change a lot of people's minds about things. Change people's minds about climate change, change people's minds about biodiversity, change people's minds about money, the economy, politics. A lot of mind changing that's going to happen. But if we want this to work, we have to understand, or we have to address the state of being, the collective state of being that supports these beliefs, of which these beliefs are actually a symptom, more of a symptom than a cause, although they are also a cause. It does go both ways. So the question then is, what is the state of being that corresponds to all of the destructive ideologies on this planet? And how does that change? And I would not encourage you to jump too quickly to an answer to that question. Yeah, back in the 50s and 60s, we pretty much thought that we had all the answers as a culture. And then we came to understand that we do not, in fact, have the answers, but we still thought we had the questions. Now we are entering the phase of realizing that we don't even know what the right questions are. That is what allows us to ask new questions. And what I've offered you is one of, maybe, in some sense, a new question that bypasses a lot of the assumptions that we carry into our questions and that make them impossible ever to answer. So, yeah. I would just offer that as a question, and maybe to personalize it too. When you've had a radical change of belief, what happened?
Working. And so what do we do to, is that working? Oh.
Yeah.
So the shift comes from the recognition that I am that and it is me. And that means the earth, and then we become stewards, and that we want to help because it is us. So how do we rapidly shift, other than something like meditation and those kinds of practices? I mean, and in addition, I guess it'll be in addition because meditation helps stabilize it. But it's got to be a radical shift of being.
Yeah. So who's we here? Yeah. I guess
all of us.
I guess I guess one of the questions that I'd like to bring in, or one of the ideas I like to bring in, is that the we that we're talking about actually extends far beyond human beings. And that if it were up to us completely, we would fail for sure. I notice, when I'm honest with myself, that whatever progress I've made toward being more empathic, more compassionate, more conscious, has not been of my own doing, but has come through, as a gift, has come through experiences that have changed who I am, from information that has come in and changed who I am. When that happens, then I become eventually a carrier of those information, of those experiences, of that information, I will call it information. I think I mentioned before, something that comes in and forms me. So what enables that information to spread, to be transmitted from person to person and from non-person, from non-human beings to human beings, is the maturation of a process, of a ripening that makes us ready to receive that information. And as I was saying before, when that ripening has not reached its fulfillment, the old story that we live in has an immune system that will keep out the offending information. So yes. Okay, so we can look at humanity collectively, or civilization at least, not including indigenous people perhaps, but look at civilization as reaching the fulfillment of a state of being that goes along with a collective story, a story of the people. And noting, so when you carry information that can contribute to the evolution of another person, at first you like, oh my God, I see it now, I've got it. I've had this ayahuasca trip and I understand now, or I've had this spiritual experience, I understand now. Let me tell everybody, you, here's the information, here's the truth. Why aren't you listening? What's wrong with you? It's so obvious, it's so clear. It's about gift, it's about gratitude, we're all one, okay? Like you have that information and it's not working, it's not penetrating. Because it's not the right information for that person at that time. And we learn eventually to ask, to wait for an invitation that will then bring the information through us in the appropriate way. to be sensitive to the invitation. And the invitation comes from the incipient breakdown of somebody's story of themselves and story of the world. When that story begins to break down, that creates, may not be an explicit invitation, but you can feel the pull and the naturalness of the sharing that comes, instead of a feeling of forcing it. Because when you force it, and you can recognize, and this takes some learning, but the way to learn is that the forcing is met with resistance, a counterforce. So identifying that, becoming uncomfortable with that forcing, recognizing the counterforce, then as soon as you push a tiny bit and you feel the counterforce, then you pull back. And it becomes much more easy, much more flowy. I hope that's not too abstract. Yeah.
Hi. I'm going to ramble a bit here, because I haven't read your latest book, by the way, but I'm going to ramble and just put some thoughts out, because I really want to hear you respond to them. So I'll just briefly say, so Thomas Kuhn, right, the guy who came up with Structure of Scientific Revolutions and Paradigm Shift, he said basically it can't be done. You cannot change people's lives. There has to be generational change. And then the old ideas just fade away, and new people are, the new generation grows up with the new ideas and the new structures, and that becomes the new paradigm. That's the most pessimistic interpretation. And then, as you just alluded, I think that when I think about like what could intervene in that kind of pessimistic, very slow intergenerational change, one thing is desperation. When people are, as you just said, when people's our lives are breaking down in some way, then they do become more open-minded, and for better or worse, we're very likely to see a lot more of that in the coming years. So a lot more people might become open to new ways of seeing. There was one more thing I wanted to say. Let me think. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, and then kind of what you and someone else was saying a minute ago is that it has to be experiential, as you said. You can't just convey ideas and expect people to buy them. There has to be some experience of newness, or some experience of that enables an epiphany of recognizing that the truth that they've been holding on to is no longer functional, or no longer appropriate, or not as true as they thought. So yeah, just love to hear your take on any of that, because I'm very, very interested in like how to change people's minds, and it's a thorny one. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so paradigms, like it's not always true that people never let go of their paradigms. Sometimes it does happen. Usually because circumstances change so much that your old paradigm becomes irrelevant. And usually what happens is you cling to it for as long as possible, and eventually you can no longer hold on to it. And even then, you kind of go back to it when you can. Maybe it'll revive. So what collapses and disintegrates a paradigm or a world story, a story of self, could be something like public, something collective. It's like a financial crisis, which could obliterate, the story of what security is and what wealth is, and its association with investments and bank accounts and things like that. Like that's a pretty strong story that we live in, and that could easily be swept away with a financial meltdown or a large solar flare, which could destroy all money as we know it, pretty much, except for cash and gold and stuff like that. But electronic, all investments, anything that's on computers, bonds, stocks, et cetera, that could easily disappear. And then we would be in a new story. But it can also happen through a breakdown in health, where like the story I grew up in was medicine is progressing, recording one miraculous accomplishment after the next, and what is the next miracle technology that's going to come through that will make us healthy forever. And part of that story was, if you're sick, you go to the doctor and the doctor can fix you. And there might be a few things that he can't fix yet, but we're working on those, and progress is accelerating. So that was a very strong story. And when people test out that story because they get sick and it doesn't work, and they're told that you're not sick because our tests don't detect any symptoms. And you're like, but I hurt everywhere. And you go to specialist after specialist, and finally someone says, oh, all the other doctors were wrong. Actually, you do have a condition. It's an autoimmune condition, and that's why you're hurting all the time. And you weren't crazy after all. You shouldn't actually be on psychiatric medications to treat your delusion that you're sick, because you actually are sick, but we really can't do anything about it except for palliate symptoms. That process of going through to the specialist after specialist, and your faith in what you were told and what you had taken on can disintegrate. Or, I mean, for me, this happened when I went to Taiwan when I was 21 years old. Actually, the first time I was 19. And I thought I knew how the world worked. I studied mathematics and philosophy. I was very rational. I was very, thought that the scientific method and its institutions had pretty much gotten a grip on reality and on causality, especially on causality. And maybe there's still some corners to fill in, but we pretty much have the story. And then I went there and experienced things that were patently absurd, things that I would have ridiculed if they had not happened to me, things that I would have ascribed to confabulation or selection bias or something like that. I mean, I was pretty sophisticated, and they were like, it was just undeniable. Like reality is bigger than I thought it was. And I could have held on to, if I had tried really hard, maybe I could have held on to the story I had been living in that said that Chinese medicine is quackery, and that ghosts are superstitious. I could have held on to the worldview that I'd had, and by saying, and all these local people who are telling me these stories and believing these things and going to temples, et cetera, they're all, subject to this mass delusion of some kind. And I could have taken an anthropological lens and studied it as a subject, and objectified them and dissected it. I could have maybe maintained it, but what about my own personal experiences? Well, I wasn't in my right mind that day. Or what's more usual is just to take those and put those in the category of can't explain that, and I'm not going to allow that to disrupt my story. So, and that's what I would have done if I had been happy in the story that I had been in. But I was not happy. I was miserable, and a lifelong protest against the world that had been offered to me as normal was reaching its fruition. Therefore, my intellectual immune system was weak, and these data points came in and basically said, okay, Charles, you don't know. You thought you knew, and you do not know. And I was so like, okay, I don't know, like panic. I don't know. So maybe it's this. And that's a very, very delicate state to be in, the state of I don't know. It makes one susceptible to enrollment in a cult, to enrollment in fascist stories. When the story breaks down, we're desperate for a replacement story. So that's why fascism is so it thrives in times of breakdown of meaning. breakdown of collective meaning and a collective sense of the people. So I guess maybe one thing that we can do is when we can be aware of this general breakdown that's going on. As our collective stories break down, so also do many people's individual stories. And we can become carriers of replacement stories, of a new story that is an alternative to the fascistic stories. Instead of trying to drag people back into old stories. So we can become carriers of that and respect in ourselves the sacredness of the space between stories and not rush too quickly out of insecurity to a new story. Not to rush too quickly. Yeah, like we are meaning-making beings. It is okay to do that. That's fundamental to humanity in our current stage of consciousness, to make meaning. But to maybe also be okay with not knowing, with not having a coherent meaning that makes sense of all of the things that are coming to us at this conference. Some of which may be contradictory to each other, and to hold that for a while. Yeah, I hope that's relevant. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Is a time of risk and opportunity. It feels scary. I think a lot of us feel scared, but becoming a carrier sounds kind of inviting.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does that mean to you? Take us a little further.
Becoming an infectious agent of the contagion.
Yes, in a good way. I want to be infectious in a good way.
Yes.
What does that look like?
Becoming a carrier. Mm-hmm. Yeah, becoming a host. So yeah, like one of the okay, I mean, I think books are overrated, generally speaking, but one of the traps that we have in this civilization is the trap. It's one of those wrong questions, which is, or maybe not universally wrong, but one of those go-to questions that's often not the right question, which is, how do I do it? And as far as becoming a carrier goes, it is not a question of how you do it. It's a recognition that it's happening, and an accepting of yourself as a carrier of a new story. And however you want to understand it, it could also, it's not just like a new story and you're going to tell people, here's how it is, but it's a carrier of a certain vibration that is coming into its time on Earth. And to even, so like the how-to could be to realize and accept and understand that this is already happening to you. In certain initiation processes in other cultures, a key part of the process is to have something spoken, something acknowledged, something named. Because to name a thing is to bring it into another stage of its being. So here I am naming something that's already there. So you have, so it's like a, yeah, it's like it crystallizes something that's already present. And then once that happens, asking how do I do it isn't actually coming from, the how do I do it question could be coming from dare I really believe that I am a carrier from this? No, I have to do something in order to be a carrier for this. But actually, once that crystallization happens, everything that you do will carry that vibration in you. And yeah, there's still going to be habits that are left over from the place where you had been, your old story, habits that materialize as the structures of your life, relationships that you have with other people, with work, et cetera, like there's going to be internal and external manifestations of the old story that you had been in. Not to mention that we live in a society that concretizes, that is built out of the old story that we were collectively a part of. So I'm not like saying that you're going to be immediately a completely clear, resonant vibration, but it is in you. And one reason why these conferences are so important and why I like to come to them is that the new story, it's like carrying an ember, that when you get near other ones, the collective heat brings it into flame and heats up the ember in everybody. And then you go forward from these gatherings carrying a much brighter, hotter flame of the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Mm-hmm.
I'd just love to hear you continue just a bit more in what you were talking about the climate, the new story of the climate if you could, I don't know if it's role-playing a couple of conversations you may have had with people who are in fear and trying to motivate through fear, and how that conversation changes, just examples you could give about how that operationalizes in addition to the energetic of being a loving carrier.
Mm-hmm. All right. So a lot of people, when they're faced with climate news, they feel helpless, because when you are in the story of the cause of the dying of the earth is greenhouse gases, then the action you can take is going to only have an infinitesimal effect. And in fact, if you do nothing whatsoever and everybody else does something about it, no problem. And if you do all that you can and nobody else does anything, then your efforts were wasted. So there's a disempowerment there when we think on a scale that's so global and so abstract in the sense of invisible gases, and the real effects are going to be faced 30 years or future generations and so on. It's not a very psychologically compelling reason for action. So one of the things that I'm advocating here is a shift of rhetoric and focus onto, like I called it, the organs and tissues of Gaia, and that means everything, including human beings. On some level, we know that you cannot have a healthy climate when the political climate is not healthy, when the social climate is not healthy, when men are committing violence against women. That's part of the same matrix as humanity committing violence against nature. The way that we treat the most vulnerable people in our society is going to mirror inevitably the way that we treat the most vulnerable places on Earth. Like, it's all part of the same thing. Therefore, the healing in any one of these realms is going to be a healing influence for the whole thing. From the living planet view, the organs and systems view, you can extend your love and care to something right in front of your face. It could be a tiny plot of land. It could be a garden. It could be a river that's threatened, a road that needs to be stopped, a fracking project that needs to be stopped, something that is violating that which we can see and feel and love and that we know intimately. Whereas in the dominant climate narrative, like, the only reason to save this forest is because of its carbon sequestration potential. The only reason to save the sea turtles is, well, what? Like, in that narrative, they have almost, and what's the reason to, what if you want to spend your life freeing somebody from death row who is unjustly convicted, or rehabilitating homeless people, or revitalizing a threatened language? What's the carbon contribution of that? But when we understand this planet as a living holistic system, we can, and I'm kind of circling around here, we can appeal to people's care outside of a scientific belief system, outside of a political ideology. One of the problems with climate change is that it's become so politicized that belief in climate change or disbelief in it has become kind of a political identifier that prevents people from actually looking at the evidence. And this is true on both sides. So, yeah, from like a holistic living system approach, I know that any healing, any care, any expression of love that I can connect somebody with is going to have a healing impact on the entire biosphere. Because we're not separate. We're all interconnected. And we may not understand the causal mechanisms by which this happens. But I've had conversations with indigenous people who are like, yeah, you guys don't understand climate change at all, because your understanding of cause and effect is primitive. Some Dogon, like I talked to some Dogon guys, and they're like, we have a 70,000-year-old system of knowledge. Like, their story goes back 70,000 years. And they're like, climate change is in large part caused by by removing sacred artifacts from where they're supposed to be and putting them in museums in London and New York, because those were put there as a communication to the land. They were put there intentionally with ceremony. And when we stop doing that, when we take them away and we break the covenant between the planet and humanity, of course, the climate is no longer going to be suitable for human civilization to thrive. And this is actually kind of answers an anomaly in climate science, which is the anomalous constancy of the climate over the last 10,000 years in the Holocene. And I'm not, this is just one narrative that I'm not 100% confident in, but apparently the fluctuations were a lot more intense in the Pleistocene than they in the previous era than they have been in the Holocene. It's as if something is keeping things kind of steady. And so these Dogon are like, yeah, that is the ceremonies that we are doing in communication with nature. So, okay, like, I'm not saying that, I'm not offering that as a substitute for greenhouse gas-based explanations. But I really hesitate to just dismiss that, oh, those superstitious Dogon, we better teach them how to know as well as we know. Just as we need to teach them how to live as well as we live. Like, that is the mindset of colonialism. And it is wearing thin as we become less convinced of the power and rightness of our way of life. We are also becoming less convinced of the power and rightness of our way of knowing, of our epistemology. And that opens the door to something from outside the story. For example, indigenous ways of knowing. Like, maybe they were onto something. Maybe we don't know. Maybe we have something to learn. Yeah.
Yes, so regarding climate change, first of all, regarding these Dogon people, I do think they have a lot to teach us. However, I don't think indigenous people like that have any understanding of the biochemistry of the atmosphere and things of that nature. What I am trying to say is, I thought in the ballroom you kind of disparaged the notion of saying to people, look, it's in your interest to save this forest. It's because if you don't save this forest, your life is going to get really bad. I felt you were saying, let's appeal to them on some other level, on some deeper level or whatever. But just from a practical point of view, it seems to me if climate change is to be reversed or stopped, most of the people out there in the world, that's what they're really going to care about. That's what's going to get them to change their action, to change their behavior. If they see that their life could be impacted, like the people on the Gulf Coast. Many of them were like, Trump Republicans. And now we're saying, well, maybe there is something to this climate change. So that's what I'm asking, sort of as a practical matter. If we don't continue with that kind of an argument to people that it is going to negatively impact their life, I think that makes it more difficult to deal with the issue.
The problem is that people don't believe you that it's going to negatively impact their life because so the reason I was late is I got absorbed by Bruce Damer, who was speaking up there, not realizing that this was not a plenary session. And so that's why I was late here. I was like, I thought that was a plenary session. So I was staying there. I'm like, well, this will be after that. Anyway, so I was listening to him and he referenced, he didn't name him, but an article by Steven Pinker, which is came from a book that he wrote basically arguing that things are getting better and better and better. And he offers strong quantitative arguments. Life expectancy is at the highest level ever. Literacy is at the highest level ever. Fewer people are dying from violence. GDPs per capita is at the highest level ever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these metrics of well-being are, so basically, things have been getting better and better and better according to what we measure. At the same time, as life is dying all over Earth. Who was it? Paul Stamets was talking about the dying of the honeybees. Who was talking about that we're like at 2%? J.B. McKibben, the naturalist, says we live in a 10% world. If you look at fish biomass, if you look at the descriptions of North America by the early colonists describing the incredible abundance of life, entire islands that looked like they were upholstered in white cushions because there were so many seabirds. Fish runs that created like a tidal bore, like created a wave when the fish runs were coming in, a wave where you could literally walk on the water because there were so many fish, where you could throw a bare hook in and catch a fish in an instant. Oysters that were like a foot across, just like this incredible abundance. Looking out, today we are excited if we see like a small pod of whales. Imagine looking out and seeing thousands of whales whose plumes fill the air with mist. Like that. So this increase in measurable human well-being coincides with the dying of life all over Earth. So our experience says, if we accept those measures of well-being, our experience says that we are not going to be affected. Yeah, hurricanes, but we'll build cities inland. Air pollution, maybe we can make bubble cities. We could potentially replace ecosystem services with technology. Giant carbon-sucking machines in every city. Hydroponic factories to make our food, like is already happening in the Netherlands, which is I think it's like the second biggest food exporter in Europe. Robotified, scientific hydroponic factories. So meat grown in vats, like animal cell tissue, animal cell cultures to make artificial meat. Like all this stuff is happening. So I think that we need another reason, because whether or not I don't know if we could actually replace all ecosystem services with technology, but whether or not we can, our experience of the last several hundred years, we have more and more people, more and more GDP, more and more wealth, longer and longer life expectancy, although that's leveling out, at the same time as more and more environmental degradation, less and less life. So our experience belies the rhetoric that bad things are going to happen to us if we cut down the Amazon. Like, do you really believe it? Like, on some level, 1 minute, yeah, some level we believe it, and on some level it's like, well, you know, that's happening somewhere else. It doesn't matter. It'll be okay. We'll think of something. Maybe we will think of something. So the question then becomes not we have to change, not how do we survive. It becomes, what world do we want to live in? It becomes, what do we serve? It becomes, what is beautiful to us? And if we are going to serve a living world where there are millions of whales again, if we're going to serve a beautiful world, then something has to change. Because we have been choosing death. As a civilization, we've been choosing death every day and every year for centuries or thousands of years. The dying continues. Something has to change. And I think part of what has to change is that we have to see nature as a beloved. And to say, yeah, even if global warming is a hoax, even if we'll be fine, even if we will solve the problem with technology, I still want a world with whales. I still want the Amazon rainforest because I am in love with this world. And anything that we can do to carry that vibration, to carry that story, to carry that energy of love, that will contribute to the conditions for a different choice. That is our job here, is to contribute to the conditions for a different collective choice. That is the metamorphosis that collectively we're going into right now, the possibility. That is the initiation that we are undergoing. Will we succeed in passing through this initiation? That's up to us. Thank you.